Hello, please let me see your ticket stubs for the double-edged double bill. This week, The Exorcist gets a letter delivered by the Postman. Each week, Adam Thomas and Thomas Mariani will come to the table to discuss the randomly selected yin and yang of a double feature. Then, both will have to pick a number between 1 and 10 in order to seal their fates for the next episode. One will have 2 good movies, the other one 2 bad ones. Let the chaos begin. I am Thomas Mariani, and I am here. Adam is still on his sabbatical as of yet, so I'm just standing here all alone in the middle of this dark Georgetown house, waiting for the devil to possess me, but who could save me? Oh, wait, it's the Pony Express himself, coming back to the show. One of our favorite guests, returning for the first time in far too long, is Mr. Kaycee Jarrad. Kaycee, welcome, and you have a package for me?
I do! Oh dear, it's the wrong kind of package. I thought this was when I was, like, delivering a pizza. Oh no. I've fallen on hard times since last I was here.
You're getting on those triple X, it's not a porn parody, or whatever. But welcome back, Kaycee, to the show, in which this week, we're releasing an episode right before the Oscars, and we like doing some kind of thing tied to the Oscars and stuff like that for our show, where we cover our good and our bad pick. And the topic we came up with was Best Picture follow-ups, which I'll fully admit, I kind of stole this from one of my favorite shows, Screen Drafts, did an episode recently about the Best Picture follow-ups of sorts. And I thought it was just an interesting topic, because basically, with Best Picture follow-ups, it'll be the directors who directed a Best Picture winning film, the movie that they would follow that up with sort of like the carte blanche of having won an Academy Award. So, like, for example, you have, Guillermo del Toro, one for The Shape of Water, so he follows it up with A Nightmare Alley, a movie that I don't think would have ever been made unless he had the cachet of the Best Picture winning Shape of Water, which is also funny given that movie was also just very much dumped to, like, hey, let's release you right alongside Spider-Man, where no one can see you.
Honestly, and maybe you and I are going to differ on this, but when you said that, I just thought to myself, imagine spending your Best Picture clout on Nightmare Alley.
I am also not a fan of Nightmare Alley. That's not one of my faves. I prefer the 40s black and white movie, which I'm sure is something you might agree with shockingly, Kaycee. Do you like old black and white movies?
I do like old black and white movies, but I've actually never seen Nightmare Alley.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that one's pretty good. But anyway. So you decided to come on for Best Picture follow-ups. Did that fascinate you as a topic, Kaycee? What interested you in doing Best Picture follow-ups as a topic?
2 things. 1, I thought I would talk about the conversation, and I was excited for that. Forgetting you guys did an episode on it. Right. 2, like you, I also have been Screen Drafts pilled, and I really liked that episode.
Yeah.
Screen Drafts, it's great if you have 5 hours to kill.
That's true. Yeah, well, you're only like an hour and a half, so stick with this.
Yeah, that's your commute in a day compared to your commute for several weeks.
Right. Yes.
And I sat through that entire Spielberg draft.
Oh, yeah, all 3 parts of that Spielberg draft? Yeah, for sure.
All 3 parts. I still have not cracked open that producer draft, because, like, okay, I need a break. I'll come back to this in July. But yeah, I've also been interested in that. It's similar to another podcast you and I are both fans of, Blank Check. I really like when you are on the top of the world, what do you do with that clout? And it's a very fascinating list of movies that are either, okay, this is a slam dunk. Some of these are also Best Picture winners. Some of these are magnum opuses. Some of these are weird ass passion projects you would not imagine anyone making. But this is like, okay, this is the thing that inspired me. I'm going to go with this at this moment because I'll never get this opportunity again.
That's true, yeah, because sometimes you get, like, the underrated gems, like, say, Widows, which we've covered on the show, is an example of that. And then other times you get something like, I found out that Tom McCarthy's follow-up to Spotlight was a Disney Plus movie called Timmy Failure. I was not aware of at all. That's a movie. I guess. And especially like my favorites are the ones where like the best picture follow up is a movie that's easily like way better than the one that actually won best picture. Like I would say that's the case for say Sam Mendes with following up American Beauty to Road to Perdition. Way better follow up, I
Hmm.
would argue. Or just like the weird ones where it's like one of the alternate picks was Burn After Reading, which after No Country, like that feels like almost the Coen Brothers going back to a very old style of their comedies, which I was not shocked at all by, like everyone being like, "Why would you follow up No Country with this?" It's like only the Coen Brothers would do that. Of course they would.
And I would argue that has aged. I wouldn't say aged very well because it implies that it was like there was something wrong with it at first, and there was not. People just came around on it in a way that they were not ready for it back then, in a weird way.
Right, I would agree with that. But then there's also like the big disasters. Like one of the ones we've covered is Live by Night, which is kind of like infamous in terms of like following up Argo, Ben Affleck with like that right in the middle of all the Batman v Superman stuff and Justice League, and it was just like he looks so sad in that fucking movie.
I
And
have I have no memory of that movie existing.
most people don't.
Did it just come out at the time when we were all just still thinking about the election and we just did not have the bandwidth for it?
The effects of BVS didn't help with that
Uh,
because we're coming off not too long after that. Ben Affleck looks like the meme, the "Hello Darkness, My Old Friend" meme throughout that entire movie. Another weird one is something like Nomadland immediately being followed up with Eternals. Which, say what you will about Eternals, that is a fascinating, especially like a Marvel movie.
I believe you also at least kind of dig that movie the way I do. Would you say it's the best of the post-Endgame movies?
Um, I mean, it's either that for me or Wakanda Forever, and even then, both are very messy movies. I
Yeah,
think
both are very
fascinatingly
messy.
messy movies.
Yeah, and I also really like Wakanda Forever in that. Okay, this is kind of a kitchen sink.
Well, that's very interesting. Yes, that we're both on the same page for this. But let's see if we're going to be on the same page for the movies that were picked at the end of our previous episode. Where, if you're new, every week we have two good picks, two bad picks, assign numbers between 1 and 10 for them, and we have the good pick is chosen at random and the bad pick is chosen as well. And so our good pick. That was one of Adam's choices he submitted to me despite his sabbatical, which was The Exorcist. And then the bad pick, which was my choice, and I'll just say sorry now before we do end up discussing it in a bit with The Postman.
I
But
don't forgive you.
I don't blame you. I don't forgive myself for a lot of things, especially that. But let's go ahead and start off with the good one, The Exorcist.
Somewhere between science and superstition, there is another world. The world of darkness.
Look, your daughter doesn't say she's a demon. She says she's the devil himself.
I'm telling you that that thing upstairs isn't my daughter.
The one hope. The only hope. The Exorcist.
So The Exorcist came out December 26, 1973, just in time post-Christmas. Everyone can go to the theater and see this spooky horror movie from director William Friedkin, and of course written by William Peter Blatty based on his novel. And this was Friedkin's follow-up to The French Connection, which had won Best Picture along with like Best Director, and Actor, Screenplay, and Editing. It was a very popular movie at the Oscars that year. And The Exorcist ended up being nominated for several awards, including like Best Picture and Best Actress, Supporting Actress, a bunch of things. One ended up winning for Best Adapted Screenplay for Blatty, amongst other things. You were on our kid horror episode ages ago. That was, I believe, the first episode you were on for us. But I don't know if we've ever talked about, like, classic horror in this realm before in our friendship, Kaycee. So I'm curious, what is your history with The Exorcist?
So my history of The Exorcist is like many people who are getting into old movies. I watched it probably on AMC when I was 12 years old with some of the cuss words and gory bits cut out, even though there's not that many gory bits. There probably was something cut. And I didn't quite get it. But then I've like watched it since several times. I have a I then finally got it on Blu-ray. I got the steelbook of it, and This is actually super fun. My Steelbook, it's the director's cut, but they sent it with one of the sleeves for the digital copy. And the digital copy they gave me was they messed up and sent me the theatrical cut. So they accidentally gave me both versions of the movie.
Right, because you're referring to there's the version you've never seen that came out in
Oh,
2000, where they
correction,
inserted
the
like a bunch
version
of
you've
other
never
stuff.
seen.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Which I remember that's around the time I at least heard of The Exorcist for the first time. I mean, I'd seen this was definitely a great example of a movie where I saw hundreds of parodies long before I saw this movie. Like, I am very sure I saw the Leslie Nielsen, Linda Blair starring parody Repossessed long before I ever saw The Exorcist. And yeah, so it was a movie that I remember when I first saw it. This is a problem I think I have with like a lot of sort of like horror, sort of build up, like that sort of immediately giving the movie the title of like, oh, it's the scariest movie ever made, or it's one of the scariest things that's come out in years. I think that immediately puts a weird chip on horror movie fans' shoulders, and it did for me at that time. But as I've grown up with it, I definitely do agree that I don't think it's like the scariest movie ever made, but at the same time, you do get chills watching certain elements of it, because if nothing else, like as I've grown older, I don't necessarily share the scary, terrified, like, oh my god, this is so horrifying, this idea, to me as much as, like, I get the frustration and the sort of exhaustion of, like, Ellen Burstyn and Jason Miller's characters, where it just feels like they are fucking done with the bullshit they've been dealing with. And it's like, yeah, I get that. And that only makes the horror all the more pronounced, where it's just like, oh god, now this? I'm already exhausted, now there's like a demon possessing a kid? Fuck, man. I gotta like work every day.
I got 5 demons to feed. I'm kind of in a similar spot because I've never found this all that scary. This time watching through, it finally is the thing that made me realize I think this is the best performed horror movie ever made. Because every actor is giving such an amazing performance. Jason Miller, Linda Blair, Ellen Burstyn's doing career best. Lee J. Cobb as the lieutenant. Max von Sydow being 80 years old for the first time for the next 50 years.
Yeah.
Like, everybody is firing on all cylinders in this performance-wise, and it's what carries this movie for me. And I want to ask, in terms of the thing, it's a gap I've noticed with this movie, in terms of people who are really scared by it and people who aren't. You're, at the risk of generalizing, you are Italian American, Sicilian American, if you prefer that. Were you raised Roman Catholic?
I'm technically like baptized Catholic, but I was never really raised as much as very agnostic, I guess. So that's kind of like what I've ultimately sort of felt. And I think that's what's interesting about this is that Friedkin himself is not religious at all. And he even said that like I had to compartmentalize that kind of element of it. And I think that's what's interesting about this movie, is that it kind of approaches religion as sort of like, well, it's only because we've gone through every single possible other explanation through like all the doctors and all the bursts and visits and all this other stuff. It's just like at the very last resort, even like when, whether it's the doctors or that originally suggests the exorcism or even like Jason Miller, like it's just like, well, it's kind of bullshit, but I don't know, it might like get her out of it if you do like this, maybe. I don't know. I think it's a movie that is kind of agnostic about the religion element of it.
Correct. And in fact, I also really love the doctor scenes because I'm a sucker for the let's try to address this supernatural thing going on in a scientific way, try to quantify it. And even after 10 minutes and no one finds anything, I love that trope and I wish movies would bring it back. But part of the reason I wanted to ask is because I kind of grew up similarly, Irish American families. Both my parents were raised Roman Catholic, and my joke is that I've been a lapsed Catholic since around the first trimester. So I was also raised in an agnostic household. Hell, I was raised in an atheistic household. I am arguably the most spiritual person in my family, but I've noticed a gap where people I know who even our age or older who were raised Catholic, they find this movie absolutely horrifying, and people who weren't tend to be more I respect this more than I'm actually scared by this. So that is an interesting thing of it was able to capture a religion of people being horrified in a weird way.
That's true, yeah, to the point where even like that's what kind of got people's ire at the time, and even why Linda Blair had to have like bodyguards because like there were religious extremists who were just like, you're making Satan seem attractive in this way. And it's just like, I don't know. Like if I saw this movie and I was at all religious, I would immediately just be like, oh no, I gotta go to church every Sunday or whatever. Because this is like, this demon might be in like the little girl next door or whatever, and that's upsetting. But I think that's the thing that I do respect really about the movie is that like it feels so grounded in this fascinating way to where like when Jason Miller is like talking with his fellow, I believe it's Dyer, right? Or like it's the other guy, it's the other father, Father Tom, when he's talking to him at the bar, and it's just like, I don't know, I gotta get the fuck out of here. I gotta get like closer to my mom. I can't be here. I think I'm losing my faith. Like that feels like so naturalistic and real a conversation about just like somebody who's lived with religion for so long and ultimately kind of being like, I don't know, is it bullshit? And the thing that makes him realize it's not bullshit is this horrible, upsetting event that like, why would God allow necessarily just like a child to be, possessed by a demon and have it all these horrible, upsetting things happen? It's just like, well, the only thing that proves religion is real is Old Testament horrifying shit. It's just like, yeah, it's real, but in a way where like God doesn't really have much control, and even at the end of this, like the demon gets out of the girl, but also the priest dies, so it's like we're just like, I guess nobody wins in this scenario.
Yeah, it's the 70s, man. You can't have a happy ending in the 70s.
That's true.
Yeah, if your main character flies off to have a beautiful time, there has to be a title card that says all his friends died in Vietnam.
True. Exactly. But yeah, so I guess like for you, why would you say like this feels like the best acted horror movie, especially considering there have been a lot of contenders of recent, sort of the A24, your Hereditaries and such. What do you think makes this still feel like 50 years later like the best acted horror movie?
I think it might just be quantity and quality is just so high. Like it's not just Linda Blair is really good. It's not just Ellen Burstyn's really good. Like I said, Lee J. Cobb as the lieutenant, it's a backbencher role, but he's giving his best performance since like 12 Angry Men. Jason Miller is someone who I don't think ever like quite achieved these same heights. And I'm not just saying that because I'm having trouble naming another thing that he's in. And Max von Sydow, is this Max von Sydow's like first big breakthrough with mainstream audiences?
I mean, I guess in terms of like maybe American audiences, he's been in like fucking like Seventh Seal and shit like 20 years prior to this and stuff like that. But I mean, I would say this is probably at least like the first movie that introduces him widely to American audiences and gets him to be the Swedish bad guy in many a film after this.
All the way up to Force Awakens, a character I am 100% convinced was written for the guy who played Wedge.
I believe that's actually true. I've heard that that's actually the case, that it was originally Wedge, and he was like, nah, I don't want to be in this. I'll take that Rise of Skywalker paycheck a couple years later, though. I'll do that.
No, you see, I would have to be in 3 shots for this, as compared to 1 shot. And that shot better not be more than 4 seconds.
Very true, very true. But yeah, I think it's just the fact that like it's that sort of frustration that I'm referring to that I think really makes this like so well acted to me. Like seeing Ellen Burstyn go through the ringer here, where initially she plays this like actress who seems to be like used to getting what she wants and kind of has like this more privileged life, and then as like everything crumbles around her and it's without like any kind of like solid logical reasoning of just like, oh, is it like a medical condition, is she psychologically disturbed, what's going on here, and all culminating, especially in that sequence where, like, her and the 2 guys who are visiting the house try and go up to Reagan's room, and it just throws into chaos. Like, everything's being thrown around, and that's where you get, like, the masturbation with the cross and everything else like that. Immediately gets you to that sense of, like, okay, all this frustration is eventually just, like, there's no other explanation here except the unthinkable thing that could possibly be happening. And I think that's the thing that really sells. It's just like all that frustration beautifully builds up to just realizing that, yeah, we're dealing with something otherworldly. And even when the otherworldly stuff happens, there's still like these moments where we have to kind of like pause. Like I love probably my favorite scene in this movie is just the bit where Max von Sydow and Jason Miller have like gone through half of the exorcism, and they're like, let's take 5. And then they go over to the stairs, and they're both just, like, sitting there, like, in a complete haze, like, oh, fuck me, what's happening? I can't believe this. Like, that feels so real in the middle of this crazy situation that they have to, like, fucking stop for a second and take a breather.
A friend of mine, Jason Fisher, every time he's having a tough day on Instagram, just posts a photo of Jason Miller just sitting down on the sofa, like, exhaling. And every time I watch it, I chuckle.
Yeah, but of course, there's also some of the more infamous things. How do you feel like some of the stuff with like Linda Blair has held up necessarily with like her transformation from adorable girl to like this demonic monster? Sort of the stuff that's been parodied a lot. Has that sort of cultural osmosis hurt any of that stuff for you, or is it only strengthened?
Not in the slightest. It is my favorite part of the movie is watching Linda Blair slowly almost decay. And then when the new voice takes over, I always get chills. I would even say one of the best ADR performances probably ever, because there were enough people who believed it that they thought it was just Linda Blair's voice.
And instead of Mercedes McCambridge.
Yeah. Unsung hero, almost literally. But I think that everything about that is a great job, and as she is slowly like decaying, and as the priests are starting to see her, and when the exorcism is starting up, and the is he actually called Pazuzu in this movie, or is that not until 2 and 3?
They don't call him Pazuzu in 1, which I think is a wise choice, because that name, regardless of being real, is fucking silly. And every time I hear it, I can only think of that one Futurama thing with Pazuzu. Yes, that's all I can think of.
I have an embarrassing anecdote. So when I was in 8th grade and trying to write a horror movie, and I was just like taking things from other horror movies I saw, I had a character named Pazuzu, and he said very earnestly, "I am not your friend, I am Pazuzu." And I am glad that was never filmed.
Now it's preserved on wax permanently on the show. I'll make sure to send over to the Pentagon to preserve.
I'm gonna need every copy of this recording when we're done.
Of course. But yeah, I think the stuff with Blair, I agree. Like, that was the stuff. I think I'll say this much. I think the stuff that's in the theatrical cut, I think, works very well. I don't really like most of the stuff they add in for the version you've ever seen, like the spider walk. I'm not a fan of. I get why people sort of were laughing at that, like some of the like less interested people in The Exorcist, like it's not that scary, like the spider walk looks silly. I agree with that, quite frankly. I think in the movie itself, like the stuff that even is more upsetting to me is all the stuff before she even officially like transforms, like that bit where she is like on the bed and she's like going up like she's in like a fucking reclining chair up and down. Let's go out of control. Just like, mother. That is deeply upsetting to me. Just seeing and hearing, especially that young girl go through that. And, especially considering William Friedkin wasn't, the most safety precautionary guy about her or Ellen Burstyn.
You mean the guy who just filmed a car chase without getting permits, doesn't care that much about safety?
This might be controversial, but yes, I would say that a renegade filmmaker, William Friedkin, didn't really give a shit about people's safety that much.
Man, he chose to retire at just the right time.
I mean, that's Killer Joe. You gotta go out on that note.
Yeah, and if he decides to make a movie again, I'm just gonna say, no, you are staying in front of a green screen. I don't like green screen movies. You are staying in front of one because I don't trust you not to nearly get someone killed.
What would you say is sort of like, if you had to pick like the scariest scene of this movie for you?
The one that's coming to mind is actually when she's just starting to get possessed at the party, and she just like walks into there and she just says to the astronaut, "You're gonna die up there." And it's like that, they never come back to that. That's never like told as like there's never a payoff, and it's just sort of implied like, oh, the guy is gonna die up there. This is just a thing that's going to happen that they can't control. It gives me a chill.
Yeah, I think particularly just the reaction from that crowd, where just like she starts peeing and everyone is just like, oh, the party's done. Like everyone was having fun and that stuff, which also just shout out such a weird eclectic group of people for that party, where you've got an astronaut, you've got a singing priest, you've got the director guy who's calling the Swiss guy a Nazi. Just a weird bunch of people at that fucking party that Ellen Burstyn. It's just like a very interesting friend group that she has.
I think that's one of the nice lived-in things about it, because if you are an actress from presumably either New York City or the West Coast who is doing a thing in Georgetown, all your actor and entertainment buddies aren't going to be there unless they're already working on the thing. So you just have to kind of be buddy with who the social class is of DC, and it's going to be politicians, lobbyists, and astronauts. And I guess a priest.
Yeah, for sure. Though, shout out, we do technically get a bit more with that character in the one of the two William Peter Blatty directed movies, The Ninth Configuration, Like, one of the characters is that astronaut. So it's technically like a weird spin-off of this movie.
Huh.
It's really weird. That movie's bizarre.
So I did not know about that ninth configuration until I was going through his filmography on Letterboxd, and also his writing screenplay credits. Fucking bizarre.
It's like the ninth configuration, Exorcist 3, but also it's A Shot in the Dark, the second Pink Panther movie, Mastermind, the Zero Mostel movie. It's a lot. He did a lot of like comedy stuff in the 60s. And then he was just like, I'm going to write this book that's extremely upsetting and gets a lot of like, becomes a bestseller. Then adapt that into a movie, get nominated for an Oscar, then make the ninth configuration Exorcist 3, and then do nothing until I die, basically. Though for the record, hot take, as much as I do really like this movie, I slightly prefer Exorcist 3 a bit more. I think that one is genuinely scary for me, and I think has some of like a great mix of sort of like this horror and even comedic elements that really works for me. I think that movie rules. I don't know if you've seen Exorcist 3 or not.
I have. I don't fully remember it, except for remembering really liking George C. Scott in it. Rarely is there a casting up in a horror sequel of going from Lee J. Cobb to George C. Scott. Typically you go for who did The Twilight Zone get when Lee J. Cobb was busy.
Right, that's true. But yeah, at the same time, though, I do love Lee J. Cobb in this movie. I agree with you. It's just like this lieutenant who's a movie fan with like this conversation he has with Jason Milner has a lot of that like really nice sort of like humor that's padded out throughout this movie that like allows the movie to kind of breathe a bit, where you have just like the back and forth about just like, oh, do you like films? I like, the discussion, the critique. I like talking about movies after. He just wants a movie buddy. That's all he wants. Yeah. He's just a movie buddy. And even later on when he's talking with Ellen Burstyn about the whole thing, it's just like, oh, hey, my daughter really wants an autograph. She's like, oh, what's her name? I'm kidding, it's for me. It's such a good bit. And, like, it allows you to like humanize these people that are going through all this horrible stuff, just like these weird bits of humor. Even like Jason Milner has that too with like when he's talking to Ellen Burstyn. What do you recommend for an exorcism? Get a time machine. Like, go back to the 16th century, back when we did exorcisms.
The movie is like being weirdly fair, and I guess not weirdly fair, but it's being remarkably fair to the Catholic Church and saying like, hey, this is an outdated thing. We're trying to modernize it. We're trying to not be this thing anymore. Like the Catholic Church, honestly, they were mad at the best possible representation they could have gotten for a movie like this.
That's true, yeah, because it is extremely fair. Even when, like, Max von Sydow comes in and he's supposed to, like, the guy who knows everything, he once again is very much treated like a guy who, like, is crumbling at this. Like, when he first gets that announcement of the summoning of just like, hey, you're going to come over and do the exorcism, and all he has to do is just kind of, like, crumble a bit. And he's like, oh, God, we're doing this after he met up with Pazuzu and everything. And, I mean, shout out while we're talking about him and, like, the Linda Blair stuff, all this, Dick Smith's makeup in this movie is astonishing. Whether it is like the over-the-top stuff like we're talking about with Reagan and how she decays sort of gradually over the movie, or even, like you mentioned, Max von Sydow looks like he would for like the rest of his career in this movie, to the degree that like I had no idea that Max von Sydow could be young, because he always looked like he was at least like 75 years old for the last like 50 years of his career.
For this last watch through for this, I was specifically looking like, are there faults in the makeup? And if you're really, really, really looking, you can kind of see it, but it's still like, did this get a makeup nomination? Do you know off the top of your head, or do you have it listed on here? Because also one of the best makeup horror movies for even with things that you don't typically think of, like the creepy effects makeup.
Actually, no, I'm looking at it here. It did not get a makeup nomination, which is very surprising. I mean, the only thing it won for was Blatty for the screenplay, but there's other things in here that I completely get it being nominated for, maybe even winning. Like, a thing that I noticed this time was just the sound design is incredible in this movie, where there's so many things that feel like, oh, like the rustling of leaves is like Ellen Burstyn's like walking down the road, or even something like there's a point where Miller is talking to like one of the other priests and their conversation gets cut off by like an airplane jet going over. Just like a really simple thing that immediately like gives you once again that immersed, lived-in feel. Even like probably the scariest thing of the movie to me is Miller's whole dream sequence, where he sees his mom on the subway come in and come out, and then you see like Captain Howdy a bit. The fact that entire thing is like kind of scored to his breathing, I think is like perfect, because like it's not actually a fake out scare. It's just a genuine like, oh, you're in the middle of this dream, but it feels like you're kind of living in it because you have that breathing underneath. Especially considering like, despite Tubular Bells being so popular for this movie, it only plays like twice, and one time it's just when Ellen Burstyn's walking down the street, and the other time is like at the very end when they look down the stairs, and then like leads into the credits. There's not a lot of like score for this movie. I know there was a score originally commissioned, and then they just got rid of it.
Good call. Like, this is also very atmospheric. I feel like this is also kind of a transition movie, now that I'm thinking about it, for the kind of old school style of horror movie, like not just like the Universal movies or the B movies or your gothic movies like The Haunting, but this is sort of like when the auteur director also does horror. Like Ari Aster owes a lot to this movie.
I think all of A24 horror owes a lot to this movie, quite frankly. Because Friedkin talked about it a lot. Like when him and Blatty were talking about making this movie, it was like we never talked about it as like a spooky movie, a horror movie. And we talked about it as just like a film and the story that's like upsetting and all this other stuff. This is, I think, one of the great examples of like a director who isn't like a horror person directing a horror movie and coming to it and just delivering something really interesting and fascinating, because Friedkin didn't really do any horror even after this. Like, he'd go into thrillers, obviously, with like Cruisin', even Killer Joe has like elements of like sort of like upsetting spookiness, but he never really quite went back to horror, I find. Oh, except for The Guardian, which was an infamous disaster. That's one of the few. So, it could go either way. It could be a Guardian, it could be this. But yeah, I think that's the kind of perspective I think adds an interesting, refreshing element to horror that I think, we often get more subject to like a James Wan who becomes like very specifically into horror, which I think is fun. I always like that kind of thing. But it's always also interesting to see like a person who isn't traditionally a horror filmmaker make their own horror movie. Gives us a completely different flavor. In this case, like one that would last for like 50 years to some degree in influence.
It's weird that he is such a, for all intents and purposes, a one-off horror filmmaker who did have that impact, but like, here's how big his impact is. I just remembered the Blu-ray of The Babadook. He is the blurb on it, and I want to say like several times on the cover, because he was a fan of the movie. It's like, oh, if he made The Exorcist, he has some clout with this.
That's true. As a follow-up, obviously, to The French Connection, I think it is kind of interesting, because that's also a movie that I think established a lot of interesting things, but I think that one, I would say, doesn't quite hold up for me as well, because I think I still like that movie. I still think it's fun, but you can tell that like this feels so much more like, oh, I just really appreciate that this movie set up like Roy Scheider got a nomination just for playing like, the supportive like best friend cop in a way, because it's like we haven't seen this before in a fucking cop movie. This is completely different. But I think like that one is more just like, oh, it's the first but not necessarily the best, versus The Exorcist is still one of the best of the, especially these like possession horror movies.
I think this is our first like notable difference in like a way we've talked about a movie tonight. That's the one where I'm like, oh, I actually really like The French Connection, but a big chunk of it is just I like looking at New York in the 1970s. I really like when I see Gene Hackman crossing a street and I go, oh, that is actually just straight up on my block. Cool.
No, that's right, because you're a fancy New York coastal elite up there.
Oh yeah, the coastal elites up here. Let me tell you about the time I shook Hakeem Jeffrey's hand and he was very uncomfortable. Not a joke.
It's too specific a Kaycee thing to be a joke necessarily.
I have one more very specific, just because it's very funny. On my birthday, which was the day before your birthday this year, we did karaoke and John Wilson was in the audience.
I can't wait for you to show up in John Wilson season 3.
We can't rule it out. I said I like his show as he was leaving the bathroom and he was very uncomfortable.
I mean, well, I get that. That guy, dude, seems like he just lives in uncomfortableness necessarily. But yeah, so how do you feel like this works as sort of like a Best Picture follow-up from French Connection, though, given you like French Connection so much?
I like that it's clearly just I took this as my next project, not necessarily because I'm on top of the world, but because I think this is a really interesting idea and he wanted to pursue it. I like that it's so aesthetically different than the French Connection. Like French Connection is almost like using the techniques that we were starting to get on documentary footage that, or like footage we were seeing on the news, handheld, quick cuts, very edited. And this is atmospheric, slower, with a slower rhythm and reminiscent more of, say, a Robert Wise movie than something like French Connection. Like French Connection is pushing forward. This is also pushing forward, but this is pushing forward with an aesthetic that is reminiscent, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, I get that. And I think it also interestingly works because you can tell, like we're saying, that he's bringing some of that naturalism that he had with, like, the French Connection in terms of shooting New York, like, to this, where the way we see, like, Georgetown, I think, is, like, such an incredible location where there's all these, like, big Gothic buildings, and also even, like, the residential areas have, like, these huge, massive quality to it, even those stairs. Like, I love how those stairs sort of play this ominous role, like, early on when the director dies. You kind of like connect the dots together where like there's the establishing shot where you see like a bunch of police crowded down near there, and then Ellen Burstyn goes up and sees that the window's open, closes it, and they find out like, oh yeah, the director was here for a bit while the babysitter left, and you just instantly put that together as soon as it's just like he died at the steps. And that just gives you immediately just like, oh, this like very small thing ends up connecting it all. Even also something where like the big effects are going on and there's like a bit of a naturalism. Like my favorite sort of effect that I'm still shocked and I don't know how they quite did this is the bit in like right before the ending where Miller has become possessed and you see his face has been kind of like demonic and you can see his eyes. And within a shot, he shakes it off and it's just like, no, and then he jumps out the window. That shot still amazes me. I don't know how the fuck they did that, but it feels once again very natural, just like it's all occurring in camera, and I'm like stunned by that.
I'm wondering if it's just he had to like hold his face a certain way to highlight the makeup, and then when he moved it, it was no longer quite as visible or something like that.
Either that or it's like a really good edit. Like it's an amazing edit, if not that.
Maybe it's computers.
That's true. William Friedkin was in one of those, like, 70s computer labs that had, like, 500 giant rectangles around him, making that effect work. For sure, that's what happened.
One question I want to ask you. Does the Iraq bit work for you?
If I had to say, I think the Iraq bit is probably, like, my least sort of, like, favorite part of this movie. I like the atmospheric look of it, and I like kind of like the build up to seeing Pazuzu, but at the same time, the whole revelation later, like, oh, it is Pazuzu at the end, like, I don't know if it was worth having, like, this whole opening bit in Iraq necessarily, but do you disagree with that?
I largely agree. I think it's neat in that it's different, but like most times Americans go into Iraq, I think it's largely a mistake.
Was that just a setup so you could do that fucking joke, Kaycee? Was that why you asked that question?
It was not, but I did think of it when I was thinking through that. When I was like making my notes, watching the movie, it's like, God, why do I dislike when Americans go to Iraq?
Don't we? But anyway, Kaycee, we've been talking about this movie for quite a while, and we do have another movie that goes on for quite a while we have to talk about. So your final thoughts on The Exorcist?
While I don't love it as much as its canonical importance, it is such a canonically important movie. I cannot actually find a fault in it, give or take in Iraq. There is nothing it does actually wrong narratively or aesthetically. I just do not engage with it to the way I do other horror movies, some older, some newer. But it's still very good. It is still a 4 stars on Letterboxd. It is still excellent. When the exorcism gets going, oh boy, does it get going. I love the sets. I love the vibe. I love the acting. Every time I talk about the movie, I feel like I love it more than I actually do, but it's still very, very good. And I still like, it's still a thing like, oh, if you have not seen it, you should see it. Even if it's homework, this is rewarding homework.
Yeah, for sure. I think especially just, we didn't really talk about it, but the amount of fucking possession movies that have come out since this movie that are still just doing this fucking movie. Like, what was the one from, like, last Halloween with Colin Salmon? That was literally just, like, praying with the devil or whatever the fuck it was. Even now, there's, like, there's that one with Russell Crowe now. That they're, like, I saw the trailer for recently. That's just like, oh, we're still doing this. We're still trying to chase that Exorcist tail. And I think few movies have ever, like, either done as well or even a bit better. Aside from, I would still say, Exorcist 3. But the other sequels are included in that, like, no, you failed absolutely to get anywhere near this. But yeah, you can tell just like that element alone that, like, we're still 50 years later trying to chase that tail. Even we're going to be getting a legacy sequel of this movie later this year from David Gordon Green with Ellen Burstyn coming back. They're gonna try and Halloween 2018 it. I'm sure you're super excited about that, Kaycee.
I mean, I am a big fan of Halloween 2018, and I even think the next ones are interesting, but David Gordon Green, you're trying me. You are really, really trying me.
Yeah, for sure. And that's going to be another trilogy, and I'm sure that'll be fun. I've heard the series is good, though. The one that ran 2 seasons.
I wanted to ask you about that because I only watched, I want to say I watched the first episode in 2015. So I have zero memory of if I watched that or one of the other, because it came out right when we really started the boom of show that's an adaptation of a famous movie from decades prior. Like, I can't tell you if I watched the first episode of that or the first episode of Rosemary's Baby.
Right, yeah, for sure. I've heard that one's good, and it has Gina Davis in it, so I'm even more fascinated.
Ooh, she's my favorite long lady.
I mean, of course. But yeah, The Exorcist, hot take, great movie, wonderful movie, a very interesting Best Picture follow-up. But let's completely go the opposite direction of interesting Best Picture follow-up with our second feature, The Postman.
In the future, after the Great War, our civilization lies in ruin. Government does not exist. Technology has been erased. And everything man remembers is gone. Out of the chaos, a lawless army will arise to prey on the few survivors. But to a people who have lost their hope, he will give them courage.
I have a feeling about you.
He will restore their memories of the past.
It's the individual that counts. I want him dealt with.
He will unite them
You have a gift, Postman.
with a message of freedom.
You want a war? I'll give you a war!
Kevin Costner, Academy Award-winning director of Dances with Wolves, brings you an epic new vision of our future.
There's gonna be new laws! There's gonna be peace!
So, The Postman also came out around Christmas time, but in 1997, December 25th, 1997, from director, producer, star Kevin Costner. And this was a movie that I picked, and this was definitely a movie that, like, was such a punchline when I was younger. Like, it was this and Waterworld were both very much punchlines of, like, oh, self-absorbed, like, vanity project, like, went highly over budget, had, like, very bloated, infamous disasters. I'm going to say this much. We did a commentary for Waterworld on our Patreon, and if you've heard that, you probably know that that movie, despite all of its problems, is still fun and still kind of interesting. The Postman ain't that whatsoever. But, Kaycee, I tasked you to watch this, and I will once again apologize. But
I'll forgive you 1 year.
Okay. But what did you think of The Postman, in case they couldn't tell from your reaction?
So I think this is just straight up the worst movie I've had to watch for your podcast, a podcast that by definition, I'm supposed to watch a bad movie every time, E.T. notwithstanding.
Right.
But my God, this was one of the most trying experiences I've had in quite a while. Because I've had an experience as I've gotten quote unquote older where I have had way more patience for long movies. I used to think of a 3-hour movie as a 2-hour movie that is a little indulgent and it takes up its time. And now I realize so many 3-hour movies are actually movies where, oh, this actually can't be any shorter. If it was shorter, they would have made it shorter, but this is actually a well-oiled machine. And I was really ready to be a contrarian and say that about The Postman. And there were a couple moments in the first 20 minutes I was thinking, oh, maybe. Nope. There was a point I was so zoned out I started thinking about paint drying.
Yeah, I didn't mention when we started talking about The Postman, but it's crucial that we talk about the fact that this is Kevin Costner's follow-up to Dances with Wolves, which won Best Picture in 1990. And I would argue was another movie that is incredibly long and I think could stand to be much shorter than it is. I don't know, have you seen Dances with Wolves, Kaycee?
I actually have never seen Dances with Wolves. One day I will watch it. maybe. It's like the 8,000th movie I ever wanted to check out.
Yeah, it's pretty low on sort of like the best picture winners you want to follow up on this year. It's just like, I don't know.
I have given myself a assignment for the year that once a month I will watch what I'm calling a homework movie, which is something that I know I should watch. It's not just I've never had the chance, it's something I've actively put off. Maybe I'll decide Dancing with Wolves is one of those, but probably not. That's probably my 2026 horror or homework movie.
I mean, it is a horror movie to a certain extent. But yeah, I just think like that movie feels very much like it feels like the definition of like an Oscar bait movie to me in terms of like the length and the languishness and all this other stuff. But I have a newfound respect for it because at the very least, Dances with Wolves is trying to tackle like interesting subject matter. I don't think it does it well, but at the very least, it's like, okay, you're trying to say something important. Meanwhile, The Postman, which if you're unaware of what this is out there, because this is a long forgotten movie, The Postman takes place in the distant future of 2013. It takes place in like the post-apocalypse where, you know, at the very beginning, Kevin Costner with his horse and he's saying, oh, this water is very dicey. It could just be about as like healthy as turpentine to drink. So everything's really gone to shit. And as he is roaming around the wastelands, he ends up getting captured by this group of evil militants who are very clear like neo-Nazis led by Will Patton. And he also runs into like a group of people that he ends up trying to help out. And along the way, it basically becomes a movie where everyone is like, oh man, Kevin Costner, you're the only one who can save us with traditional American values. Like, literally, he takes a fucking postman outfit from a corpse and becomes the postman. Just like, oh, Kevin Costner, you need to spread the good word by sharing stories with everyone. Sharing, like, these communications with people. And we will be inspired to follow suit. And also, Olivia Williams wants to get knocked up, so she wants your perfect seed.
One of the things I was almost on board with was when she was saying, like, no, it will be his child. He will be the father. It's just going to come from your seed. And then by the end of, I was like, okay, that's an interesting nuanced take. It gives her some personality. And then at the end of the movie, when she's saying, like, you're never going to see your child, it's like, you had it and you lost it, movie.
You forgot that within like an hour after that in this endless movie, that husband ends up dying. So immediately she's just like, oh no, he's gone. There's only one other man I could be with. It's Kevin Costner.
It makes me think of in like season 23 of The Simpsons when Edna Krabappel and Ned Flanders get together. There's a one-off line where Rod Flanders calls Krabappel do-over mommy.
Right, he's do-over daddy, but he's the best do-over daddy possible because it's Daddy Costner.
And also, this movie, what's the term that people use when it's just you see something you feel bad for and then they die horribly, like shoot the dog or whatever it is? This movie shoots the dog so many fucking times.
Yep, there's a lot of that. Giovanni Ribisi is one of those. Is one of like the aid guys.
Yeah, like when Kevin Costner's escaping, I thought he was going to escape with that other guy, and nope, that other guy is just also dead, and his corpse is an obstacle for the guy who's shooting at Costner while Costner runs away.
Yeah, they might as well have all had, like, post-apocalyptic, like, wallets that were just like, here's my entire family. Right before they get killed. It's about as, like, telegraphed.
One of the weirdest experiences I had watching this was going like, was this an inspiration for Fallout? Because it's like when he is like standing on the roof of a gas station having a beer and looking up at the sky, it's like, okay, you found that. Are you going to find your power armor in there? No, were you ever a Fallout guy?
I've played Fallout 4 quite a bit. But yeah, I mean, then yeah, I think that's also the case even with like a Waterworld. Feels very much reminiscent of that. Like you can see any sort of like post-apocalyptic movie from like Mad Max through to Waterworld, I would argue, inspired heavily, like a lot of the Fallout things. But I'm even curious, Kaycee, what's your relationship with Kevin Costner? I don't know if you have any kind of real like connection or thought or take on Costner necessarily.
He is, for better or for worse, his generation's Jimmy Stewart in that there is an all shucks nature to him. Like when I think of a moment in a Kevin Costner movie, is a moment in a movie I love, JFK, where one of his first scene, and one of his workers says, "Boss, the president's been shot," and it cuts close on the clock saying it's 12:35, and then zooms in on him, and he goes, "Oh no."
this is slander to that his generation's actual Jimmy Stewart of Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks is totally the Jimmy Stewart analog to me of like that era.
Yes, in terms of cultural identity, in terms of like the literal line deliveries, I feel like he does line deliveries like Jimmy Stewart does, I guess.
I mean, that would require Kevin Costner to be like interesting, because that's always been my thing. Is like I just find him very flat and dull as an actor. Anytime, because like Jimmy Stewart would have like personality, like oh gosh, gee whiz, and it's just Costner is so much more like oh god, gee whiz, I can't believe that's happening. That's happening right there. I wish he was a Jimmy Stewart.
Do you like Bull Durham, out of curiosity?
I really like Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins in Bull Durham. I don't like him that much in it. He's always like a weakling to me in like most of the things. Like I would agree with you. I think the best use of him is like a JFK, because that's an insane Oliver Stone movie and it needs some kind of grounding. So we're gonna have Kevin Costner there to like give some kind of grounding as like we do weird fucking proto QAnon crazy conspiracy theory shit. We have to have Kevin Costner in the middle there to like ground everything. But largely, I'm not a fan of his myself.
I would also say I think he works better as a supporting performance, because like even though he is kind of a interesting like watermark for all the things it does right or wrong, I think he's a great Pa Kent in Man of Steel.
I would agree with that. Yes.
I think he does work better as he has gotten older in being a secondary or tertiary character in various things. Now, has he ever gotten nominated for Best Supporting Actor? I would not be shocked if there's a Best Supporting Actor nomination within the next 10 years for Kevin Costner, because someone figured out something good with him.
Well, I mean, I would even say that's the case with like someone like Molly's Game. I think he's the best part of Molly's Game to me. When he comes in, I think he instantaneously just adds a whole different vibe to that movie that I think is fascinating. I would agree with you. I think as sort of like an elder statesman who comes in to a movie that already has been going on, I think he works. As opposed to like when he has to like be kind of toe to toe, because like this is sort of like in the weird gap between Dances with Wolves and this is him and stuff like The Bodyguard or Tin Cup or Waterworld, like I mentioned earlier, where he's like at the height of his powers. And I think all of that kind of lead up is what leads to like The Postman, where like we talk a lot about sort of like big ego driven vanity projects on the show, and sometimes, you know, I wonder like is it a bit warranted or unwarranted that like we kind of criticize. This is straight up like masturbatory in like some of the most like unsettling ways, but not even like fun ways either. What I'm talking about with like Costner being this guy in this movie who's like inspires everyone with like I am a postman sending letters to everybody, and then immediately rallies people to I guess create like the post office sort of system within like a season, and you have like fucking 20 people who are like delivering mail to people somehow. Like despite how long this movie is, what's going on in a timeline thing with this is like off the fucking rails. I have no idea how long this is.
No, he just goes away for a bit and suddenly turns out he accidentally reestablished trade in communities. So here's the thing, and this goes back to what you're saying with him being like wrong for this movie. I had a realization around like minute 45 when he is talking to Skull, where I was like, one, I thought because it's established he's a Shakespearean actor, he's going to steal the skull and he's going to start to say this is going to be his Yorick when he does Hamlet next. Like, I thought that's where that was going. But he's not desperate enough. He needs to be more one step ahead of all the people who are trying to shoot him, and he needs to have a little bit more of a chip on his shoulder. He needs to be like the Kurt Russell character in the 1980s, or he needs to be Han Solo. And what I finally realized is, if you want to give this movie an extra half star immediately, it should have been Jeff Bridges. If he cast Jeff Bridges could probably pull off the sarcasm a little bit more, and he could probably pull off the grifter bit a little bit more.
Right, because that's the weird thing is that, like, I didn't establish this earlier, but you're right, he's an actor initially, and he performs Shakespeare. There's a lot of fucking Shakespeare shout-outs that they do between him and Will Patton in this movie. But, like, that should have been the element where there's sort of, like, this cockiness and this sort of, like, oh, I'm, like, pulling one over on everybody, but then you kind of start believing the bit, and everyone else believes in the bit. But when you have Costner just kind of, like, being very flat, it doesn't really work, especially that, like, this would inspire everybody, like Lorenz Tate, to be able to be like, you know what, you inspired me so much that I'm gonna like become lead postman, I'm gonna do all the work, but then say, no, you inspired everything. Like, what, Lorenz Tate, you did all of this yourself. He was off like in the fucking cabin with Olivia Williams. You did all the work. But this white guy's just like, thank you, young black man. Yes, I did everything. Even though I wasn't here for any of this.
It's so frustrating because I was really trying to point out, like, I feel like you can fix this, but it's not like, okay, change these 3 things and you can get it to passable. It's every single scene. You have to like, okay, this should have been shot this way, or this character should have done this, or had this energy. I kept on accidentally thinking of bits I thought the movie was going to do. Like when he falls through the bridge with the body and you see the body float up, I thought he was gonna play dead, and then Will Patton was gonna order someone to shoot at him. Then when they start shooting at what they think is a corpse, he starts swimming because he has to get out of the way. I thought that was gonna be the reveal there. But no, he just comes up from the water and starts swimming. And it's like, oh, I accidentally thought of a better scene than this movie.
Kaycee, that sounds like a really well executed idea of like the setup and a payoff, as opposed to just having everything drag ass.
It's not dragging ass. The ass disappears 20 minutes into the movie.
Well, that's a good point. Right. If it was dragging ass, it'd be more exciting. That's very true. But I will say, in terms of like the stuff that I agree with you that everything would need to change, I would have 2 asterisks to that. One, the weird Tom Petty cameo, which we should talk about because it's insane.
Yes.
Kevin Costner goes over to this town that's like near a dam, and he's like, oh, I need to talk to the mayor. And the mayor comes up, and it's Tom Petty, clear as day. And fucking Kevin Costner's like, I think I used to know you. I think you're famous, right? Just like, I used to be. So he's playing himself, I guess, Tom Petty in the post-apocalypse.
There were 2 things that just filled me with joy. And that was one of them. The other one was when he's asked who the president is, he just says Richard Starkey. I fucking cackled.
Right, I knew just because that's a Beatles reference, because that's Ringo's actual name. And then that his thing's just like, they have a message over there. It's getting better all the time. It's like, which Paul told you this? Which messenger Paul told you this? And was it the dead one? But there's that element. There's the Tom Petty thing, and also the big thing that I think actually works, like the ray of sunshine that is consistent throughout this movie to me, is Will Patton is having a ball. And
yes,
I think is actually genuinely fun as like this manic, over-the-top kind of villain. Though it is kind of interesting how Costner in this movie paints the idea of like, oh, America's gone downhill by being taken over by this like awful neo-fascist group. And he's like, no, I want to fix that by going back to the exact way America used to be when I was younger. So everything can be totally fine and there are no awful aspects to it. And it's like, Kevin, honey, I need to sit you down. Because...
I'm just picturing now Kevin Costner is going around Hollywood saying, I can play James Comey.
Sure. I'm sure. But yeah, you would agree that Patton's pretty fun consistently in this movie.
He is. He was one of the things early on where I was thinking, wait, am I going to like this movie? Because his introduction is very fun. His outfits are very fun. The costuming is... So I think that this movie... misses the mark is the most generous way I can say it about the post-apocalyptic look. I wanted it to look maybe not exactly like Fallout, but hey, like Waterworld. Waterworld's fun. You can look and see how old things got renovated into new things, and I wanted more of that. The costuming is the one thing where it's like, okay, this largely works. I really like the way his army looks. I really like his not quite Soviet hat. It's nice. I like his hat. I am grasping at straws. I like your hat.
That's true. Yeah, and I think this is the great example, sort of, in terms of like a best picture follow-up thing, where, you have like what we did with talk about the Exorcist, where just like it felt like a different project that William Friedkin had passion for, versus there's a lot of passion, at least in terms of like Costner wanting to do this, and he like refused to cut down despite like bad test screenings from the runtime and all that. But in the way where it's just like, no, I can't compromise my vision of this very like stoic look at like what American values need to come back to if I'm like in the post-apocalypse, and it blew up in his face completely. And he didn't direct another movie until like Open Range, which was a Western that he did like several years later, and even then has not like directed much and has kind of laid low for the most part, except popping up in a few movies until Yellowstone, which obviously like, brought him a lot of new clout and new fame. And I love now there's all this controversy about, like, he might be leaving Yellowstone to make another giant Western epic. And, like, despite how many problems I have with The Postman, I am kind of fascinated just on a directorial level with, like, Costner's career. Because it's just like, you know what? He wants to make big, grand, sweeping, soft-spoken epics. We don't get a lot of those. So sure, Kevin, sure, you do that. I'm curious to see whatever that is. But yeah, at the same time, this feels like the great example of like the folly post the Best Picture win of just like I'm using that clout for this thing that would appeal to no one. Cost $80 million and made 20. It feels kind of like the exact opposite folly from like an Exorcist.
It just occurred to me that this movie probably might not count because of that baseball movie he did. What was the Sam Raimi baseball movie?
Oh, For the Love of the Game?
Yes. Yeah, didn't he like pretty much like call the shots on that movie?
Well, I mean, that was the thing with a lot of the movies he did in between, like the Dances with Wolves and this, where even, I would say that's more the case with like Waterworld, where there's a lot of reports that like he basically directed the last third of that movie, essentially, in production. But we went by credited directorial efforts, so, you know, there's nothing in between Dances with Wolves and Postman for that. But yeah, he was definitely sort of a guy who kind of was the auteur even when he was not the director necessarily for a lot. Like, unless it was like The Bodyguard and like Whitney Houston is like more the main person there. He was kind of calling the shots. And I think this is the movie that completely obliterated his ability to do that for a while.
We have, especially in the last like 5 years or so, swung back hard from the sarcastic the sarcastic blockbuster that almost uses self-deprecating humor as a human shield. So if we make this joke first before you can say it on Reddit, then your joke doesn't count. And we have kind of seen a swing back towards more earnest blockbusters that are like trying to take themselves seriously. I feel like this is one of the things that made people jaded about it, because this is so earnest in so many ways, and it misfires pretty much every time. Like him seeing someone holding out a letter, and he stops the horse, swings back in slow motion, goes to pick it up, and then 30 years later, someone's going, "He picked up my letter."
Oh, good fucking God. That epilogue. We have to talk about that epilogue. Because in 30 years, we went from post-apocalyptic wasteland to 1997. Kevin, how does that work? Another timeline thing. How did we get to fucking 1997 from Mad Max in just 30 years?
I will give it a modest little morsel of credit here. I didn't read that as 1997-esque. I read it as like, I guess, Star Trek First Contact caliber. Like, okay, things are being built again, but it's not quite like achieving.
There are yachts out there, Kaycee. I saw yachts and boats and all sorts of other things out there, and people looked like they were dressed up decent, like in 1997 era, like business casual.
I was really zoned out by that point. I miss the yachts.
Honestly, that perked me up, because at that point, like, I was just like, oh, fucking kill me. And then, wait, what? Wait, we did this in this amount of time? Because keep in mind, this was right after, like, the big climactic dumb battle between Costner and fucking Will Patton that's, like, so terrible, where they, like, play chicken with each other on their horses, and, like, there are all these, like, slow-mo cuts and wipes and all this bullshit. Just like, oh my God, just shoot a fucking fight scene. What the fuck are we doing here?
It was also weird there, because I was like, this movie kind of has the rhythm of a movie that knows it's going to play on TV a lot, even though I don't even think this played on TV a lot. But it has it's sort of vignette style, like, say, you know, Shawshank Redemption style movies of, okay, every 20 minutes there's this little plot. It has enough of a conclusion that if you have to go change the channel or go to work or go to get dinner, then you have seen enough, and when it cuts back to commercial break, you may or may not still be here.
I think that's what kind of put Costner on sort of a map to some degree as well, like has made him kind of last to some degree in people's minds, is like Waterworld, Dances with Wolves, The Bodyguard. Those were a lot of movies I remember switching by on cable. The dude was kind of the king of like the Sunday cable movie, as far as I'm concerned. Like, it would play on like TNT or TBS or some shit like that. For a while, he was kind of in that zone, and I felt like it was almost like, oh, Waterworld actually made a lot more money like on video and also on TV, even by that point, than it did in theaters. So it's almost like he's kind of banking on that, even though I do agree that like this was a movie that like people were shunned from, like even cheap TV syndication rights were like, no, get this out of here. This is radioactive. Go away.
I want to know if this movie would have developed a fan base of people saying, it's not so bad if they actually did have like a generation of people who watched it on TV.
The weird thing about this movie is that it also kind of feels like it's the TV edit of a movie that was in theaters at like 2 hours, 15 minutes. Like, oh, we gotta like pad out some things for commercials, so let's put all this stuff. Like, Kevin did not want to do that. Like, nope, you're getting the TV version early.
Like, I was surprised when he said he's not cutting it down because it felt cut down to me. The editing in this movie is pretty bad. Something is not established between one shot and the next. The mise en scène does not quite work. It felt like someone saying, okay, we only have time for what is absolutely necessary. And if you cut shot B, you have to cut that for shot A and shot C.
Yeah, my thought is it's less like that and it's more just like, Kevin, we ran out of film. We don't have time for coverage. You used all of the film.
We can't make any more movies until 1998. You used it all.
And keep in mind, this movie came out like, what, a couple weeks after fucking Titanic? Which is a movie that is only about 15 minutes longer, but feels like it's just runs by smoothly, perfectly, beautifully. A Best Picture winner that plays wonderfully by today's standards, as opposed to like, if I saw this in a theater, this would definitely be I am sleeping in this recliner seat. I cannot contain any. It was a struggle to get through it this time.
Yeah, we're not seeing any 4K re-releases of The Postman anytime soon.
No.
I love that you brought up Titanic, though, because I was literally having a beer out of my Titanic pint glass. I am wearing a Titanic shirt right now. My girlfriend took me to a Titanic museum for my birthday, so I walked away with a lot of Titanic merch.
True displays of love via Titanic merch.
Yeah, she knows it's a very important nautical disaster to me. I like the way people face death, and I like it when propeller guy hits the propeller.
For sure. But in case you couldn't tell, I don't think we have much else to say about The Postman, so any final thoughts possible about The Postman, Kaycee?
So, this happens a lot with Double Edged Double Bill, where when I have to watch a movie, I constrict a friend of mine from high school who we do synchronized movie watches with, because it's fun to bounce notes off of someone else and see if someone who doesn't necessarily know a lot about the movie, see how they respond to it. And we've had a lot of neat double features doing that. When I asked him to do this, he thought I was asking him to watch The Postman Rings twice, and he was so excited. And when he said the 1946 version, right? I was like, oh no, this is the Kevin Costner movie. And he fucking bailed, and I'm so fucking jealous. Alex, you owe me a bad movie for this. You got out. You got to that lifeboat, and I stayed.
When your door is the postman, you don't have much to, like, potentially float on, necessarily.
You see, in this scenario, Rose is on the door, and Jack's like, no, I'd rather just die.
Jack, I'll never let go. No, please let go. Let go of me.
Let me be free.
And Rose is replaced with Kevin Costner, so it's more just like, Jack, I'll never let go.
Oh, Jack, oh no. I'm marrying Cal. I love Cal. Okay, now that I've said out loud, romance movie, Billy Zane, Kevin Costner. I would watch this.
My OTP, for sure.
I would
Zane and Costner.
Like that, like Kevin Costner's just trying to like be very cool and understated, and Zane is just at his zaniest. I mean, in both senses of the word.
I put the coat on Costner, and I put the jewel in the coat with Costner. He rode for the horse. That's what he did. But yeah, I mean, I don't have much else to add about The Postman necessarily. It's one of those rare movies as well, because like when you hear something is so infamously bad, you want to be one of the ones where it's like, actually, guys, if you go back to it, there's a fascinating element to this that might not be good, but it's at least kind of interesting. This is dull as dishwater. It is so unbelievably dull, in a movie that, like, I completely get why it earned, like, its infamy. Like, I'll just rephrase this joke from The Simpsons, where there's a bit where Lisa and everybody's, like, at this, like, electronics store, and she's watching, like, on the TV, it has The Postman on it. And there's one where she's like, oh, director's commentary. And she clicks the button, and Kevin Costner shows up in picture, and he's just like, oh, God, I'm sorry. Oh, no, what was I thinking? Oh, man, I am so sorry, everybody. Oh, oof, oh, God. Like, that is what this movie should be. Even though Costner, I'll just read this little quote from him where he was talking about, like, defending the movie. He said, "I always thought it was a really good movie. I always thought I probably started it wrong. I should have said something like Once Upon a Time, because it's just like a modern fairy tale. It wraps itself up like a storybook ending with the statue. You know, I thought it was a pretty fun movie set against the idea of a Superman, somebody stepping up, but in this case, it's a very humble guy who's nothing but a liar, delivers mail and burns half of it to stay alive. So I like that movie."
Before you said that, I was thinking, like, I wonder what he thinks of this movie. In the same way, I wonder how Steven Spielberg thinks of 1941.
Well, no, that's the problem, is that, like, Spielberg is very critical of himself. If you watch, like, that Spielberg documentary, he's very critical of, like, his mistakes, like 1941, other things like that. Costner seems like he necessarily doesn't really dwell on any of that, but he's like, I don't know, I kind of have fun with it. I'm like, okay, Kevin, sure, you know, enjoy your Yellowstone money and make your big Western epic. I'm sure it'll be interesting, but...
Honestly, I had no idea he was on Yellowstone, even though apparently 17 trillion people watch that show now.
I know, because anyone I know over the age of 35 watches that show.
Or if you're a dad. If you're a dad, you are legally required to watch Yellowstone. I remember as the show, my parents were watching because my parents spent a summer in Yellowstone, and they just wanted to see more of Yellowstone.
That's true. You have to watch Yellowstone and World War II documentaries on History Channel. You're required viewing at all times.
And when you go to bed, be sure to have your LBJ book by your bedside table.
That's true. The Trinity.
I'm so excited for my Lyndon Baines Johnson face.
Are we all? But now, Kaycee, it's time that we get into our weekly segment, The Double Redo. Double Redo.
Double redo. Double redo. Double redo. Double redo. Double redo.
That works. So every week on the show, we do a segment called The Double Redo, which is a segment in which we, you know, in addition to the two movies we talk about for the topic, we recommend and don't recommend to you a movie each. So Kaycee and I each have a good and a bad pick related to Best Picture follow-ups to talk to y'all about. So I'm going to go ahead and start off here with my good pick, first of all, is a movie I didn't actually see until very recently, and I was have not seen the follow-up this is, because this is Anthony Minghella's follow-up to The English Patient, which I haven't seen. That's another one of those where it's like, it looks so fucking long and dull, so I don't know if I'm ever going to watch that. But I'd heard a lot of other stuff about his follow-up, The Talented Mr. Ripley, which, if you don't know, is based on a novel and a series of novels. Apparently there's characters in a bunch of them, but Mr. Ripley himself, Tom Ripley, played by Matt Damon, he's a post-college graduate in the 50s, and he is tasked by his boss to go after his son, who has been in Italy for so long, just kind of like living up life. And he ends up going over there to meet up with Jude Law, who plays the son, and his fiancée, Gwyneth Paltrow. Immediately, Matt Damon becomes sort of like fascinated with like their carefree life in Rome, and also is very clearly like attracted to Jude Law, in as much as like a 90s movie can allow him to be clearly like sexually attracted to him. And I think there's this really fascinating thing where like it's this movie about like this Tom Ripley character who is initially kind of like unassuming, because like, oh, it's young floppy-haired Matt Damon just off of Good Will Hunting. I'm sure he's totally like innocent and sweet, but you establish a lot of things about how like he really is good at being like at imitation, like he can do voices very well and mannerisms, and he basically starts to take over Jude Law's life like on the sidelines, and even spoilers, he ends up murdering him about halfway through the movie. So he ends up taking over his identity and all like the different facets of that. And it's I think an astonishingly great movie that I had heard about, and I think has gotten a lot more sort of like cult appreciation in recent years, and it was nominated for some Oscars and stuff, but it feels like for a large point disappeared. And I always just kind of assumed like, oh, this is kind of like a, you know, a stodgy Oscar movie that I never saw. But it's a really fascinating kind of like comic thriller that has great performances from not just Damon, but also Jude Law, Gwyneth Paltrow, Philip Seymour Hoffman as a supporting role. Always fun seeing him be really fucking cool in a movie. James Rebhorn, who plays the dad, one of my favorite character actors. It's this really fascinating movie just about like a guy who has no discernible life of his own, kind of like leeching on to people and like sucking sort of the life dry while being very like cute, adorable, like 90s era Matt Damon. And I think it's a fascinating movie that has like so many like great twists and turns I wasn't expecting, even like after that Jude Law thing in the middle. There's like so much other stuff that I think is incredible about that movie afterward. And it's just like all the way up to its very like chilling ending. I was deeply fascinated and engaged the entire time. It's another movie where like that one is about like 2 hours 20 minutes long, flies by at a clip. It just like is so engrossing the whole time. Wonderful little movie. And then my bad pick is kind of like more in the Postman range, even though this was a very successful movie, very acclaimed movie. The director won the Best Directing Oscar right after he had won one the previous year. I have The Revenant from Alejandro Gonzalez Iñárritu, and this is a movie that, like I said, it got like so much praise. Leonardo DiCaprio finally won his Oscar for this movie, and I know a lot of people who love this movie, but I think this and Birdman, which are the two like Iñárritu movies I've seen, like I still kind of like Birdman, but The Revenant I think is even more exemplifying of like all the worst traits about Birdman to me, where it's like all these elaborate, endless one-shots, and it feels like very showy, very cold, very sterile, and any attempt to actually engage me with like these characters on an emotional level never really works. There's a whole thing with like Leonardo DiCaprio's son, who is like his child from like having love affair with a Native American woman that feels like so like off to the side, even though it's kind of his motivation to like continue on, where they try and like have their cake and eat it too, where it's like it's there, but also it doesn't really matter on any like actual like engaging, engrossing like emotional level. And like just so many endless scenes of DiCaprio like being so immersed in like, oh, I had to be method and eat like this, actual raw guts and other bullshit like that. It just feels so dull to me, despite how like all the crap that's going on there. It feels like it's just kind of wasted on, especially like there's like not many other people. Like honestly, the only person I found any kind of engagement with was Tom Hardy, who just says pelts a lot and has a weird accent that I know isn't historically accurate whatsoever. That's at least something, as opposed to just like Leonardo DiCaprio eating bison or Domhnall Gleeson being there and a few other interesting actors just kind of being there. It just feels like it's once again it's this movie that is so caught up with like sort of the Oscar bait idea of like, oh, we have to show off our technical prowess and our ability to like just like really immerse you in this environment by just like shooting it for a while, when really that doesn't do anything for me. It just feels like I'm watching a long ass fucking like picture that barely isn't like 24 frames per second. It's just one frame forever going on a loop, and it just does not feel, despite all the technical elements of it that are like so like well crafted, I guess, it doesn't mean jack shit to me if I'm kind of bored this whole fucking movie.
Yeah, 2015 was sort of like my low point of inability to see movies in theaters, and the cycle from being so bummed that I missed The Revenant to not being bummed in the slightest that I missed The Revenant. I'm probably never going to get back to seeing that movie. I'm even apprehensive to go back and watch my Birdman Blu-ray, even though I'm looking at it right now at this moment and still think of that movie very fondly. And also, I am so glad you've gotten to Talented Mr. Ripley. I reference that movie quite a bit, not just because I work in New York politics sometimes, and when George Santos became a thing, that is how I started saying like, oh, you ever see Talented Mr. Ripley? That's what that guy's doing.
That's so true.
In November, for the friend who we do synchronized movie watches, I plotted out 3 noir adjacent movies for Noirvember, but they were Patricia Highsmith adaptations. And so we did Strangers on a Train, Talented Mr. Ripley, and Carol. And my God, Talented Mr. Ripley, I had seen it before because I watched it just after reading The Disaster Artist, which might actually be one of the things that got that movie to be like reappraised, weirdly enough.
Right.
I watched it then, I liked it. I watched it again last November, absolutely loved it. It is one of the best neo-noirs. It is a beautiful looking movie. It's a wonderful character study. Everybody in the movie is, to be grass, everyone in the movie looks really hot and they look really good in all the costumes and all the sets. And it made me want to just be in Italy eating food and drinking wine, even though it's not necessarily the most optimistic, chipper movie.
No. Also a shout out, edited by Walter Murch, one of the great editors, and
Really?
such an amazing edit job on that movie. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible the way that movie is like constructed. It's so perfect, especially even like the opening credits. I love the look of those opening credits. It almost looks like one of those album covers that they're referencing, just like, oh, you know Bird? Look, my ship's called Bird. Which I love that bit. But Kaycee, what are your choices for the double redo?
So I went back and forth on what I would choose for the double redo for the good pick, but I'm settling on what is probably my favorite Best Picture follow-up, which is The Conversation. I watched it last year because it was what I've been calling a homework movie. I'd been putting off for years because I thought this is just going to be a movie that has its moments, but is a tedious thing in the middle of two Godfathers. And it is so far from that. This is the cleanest Coppola movie I've ever seen in terms of just like it moves at a fucking clip. And it's kind of amazing that something this good came out between productions that were that engrossing. This is just a brilliant little thriller. It looks great. It sounds great. It's edited well. It's acted well. And the way in the beginning of the movie, they introduce what is going to be the tape of notes where it's just all static. There was a moment when I was wondering if there was something wrong with my TV, and as it kept going and they were cleaning it up, it becomes like more clear and you're able to understand the conversation more. You hear it better. That's not just good. I want things to rip that off. That should have become a norm of how people show unclear audio, the way texting in movies is now just you see the words on the screen while they're looking at the phone. It is truly a masterpiece. It is maybe Coppola's second best movie. It blew me away. It immediately shot from I guess I have to watch this too. This is one of my favorite movies of all time. And my bad pick, I only have watched because it was Regal Cinema's mystery movie of, I believe, November 2022. The Greatest Beer Run Ever, which, not the movie's biggest sin, but that movie doesn't have a title card up front. So when you're watching it as a mystery movie, everyone in the movie was just slowly going, what the fuck is this movie? What is it even called? And you could actually like see a wave of people like identifying an actor and Googling what was he in 2021 just to figure out what the movie was. It's Peter Farrelly's follow-up to Green Book, and it is better than Green Book in that it's slightly less offensive to sensibilities of people, but not better in that he has decided what his thing is. Apparently is just having a movie come out that has a critical look of something from the 1960s, and all it really does is say, hey, the war in Vietnam was bad. Zac Efron thought the war in Vietnam was good, so he brought a suitcase full of PBR. But then when he was in Vietnam, he realized sometimes bad things happen in war. And it's clawing. It's largely dull. It is so bizarre and actually kind of telling about Green Book that someone wins Best Picture in such a dramatic, high-profile fashion, and their next movie is a direct-to-Apple Plus movie that doesn't even get awards consideration in the slightest.
So yeah, I haven't seen The Greatest Beer Run Ever. I'm probably gonna avoid watching the post Green Book Peter Farrelly movies, because Green Book just seemed kind of like this like sad realization that we are not far behind the Days of Driving Miss Daisy winning Best Picture, unfortunately. So I was just like, yeah, I don't know if I want to keep supporting that. And apparently at least the Academy is just like, oh yeah, we were like drunk. We're very sorry. We're not going to do that again. So hopefully that stays. I don't know. We'll see.
Imagine the night Green Book wins, telling yourself, hey, you know what the frontrunner is going to be in 4 years? Craziest goddamn multiverse movie ever with Michelle Yeoh doing kung fu with butt plugs.
Look, I'm very sure the Academy woke up that next day after Green Book won Best Picture and was like in bed with Peter Farrelly, just like, oh, God. Look in the mirror, just like, you fucking piece of shit. I can't believe you did this.
And also, you watch after I said that, they just give it to All Quiet on the Western Front.
Well, that's true. Good point. You know, who knows? That might happen. We have the Oscars haven't happened yet as we're recording this. But yeah, The Conversation is a movie we've talked about in the show. I think that is a tremendous movie. What I loved too with that movie was telling Adam about it and him saying just like, I didn't know this movie existed. I think the fact that it came out in between the two Godfathers, I think really hurt it, which is a bummer considering like it was nominated right alongside The Godfather Part 2, which won obviously like multiple awards. And I would agree, I think is at least the most underrated Coppola movie for sure. It's like the sound design is immaculate, as you mentioned, but also just like one of my favorite Gene Hackman performances, especially as like a meeker individual who at the same time is like has so many like, you know, inherent like monstrous tendencies and stuff like that, and so much great stuff. One of the few John Cazale movies that are out there, and I think he's incredible in this small part. I agree with you about that opening is amazing, and just like some of the best like sound design just ever in a movie overall with that whole thing. Tremendous. If you have not seen that movie, definitely watch it and then go back into the archives where we talked about that, I believe, with Jack on our Coppola episode. So, real contrasts with those two movies.
His two most underrated movies.
That's true. Good point. Both great. But let's repeat our titles for everybody out there. I have my good pick of The Talented Mr. Ripley and my bad pick of The Revenant.
And I had my good pick of The Conversation and my bad pick of The Greatest Beer Run Ever.
Yes, and so now we're going to be winding down and heading to the end, and we'll be doing our picking for next week on that, so stay tuned for that. But before we do, we have to thank some people like Chris Oliver for the intro and outro music used in our show. Listen to more of his music at chrisoliver.bandcamp.com. Thanks to Christian Thorlally for our artwork. Follow him at Night of Water on various social. That's Night with a K _of_water on various socials for all his great artwork out there. And thanks, of course, to our loyal Patreon supporters, patreon.com/DEDBpod, where for just $1 a month, you all get access to, polls where you get to help us pick individual movies we cover, and also bonus podcasts we produce every month. Like I'll just say, this is March now, the first episode of March, so get ready for our March Madness episode all about Best Animated Film. We'll be doing that for this year. It'll be a lot of fun. And then you all get to vote this particular week we'll be doing in April to tie in with Evil Dead Rise, an episode about monstrous moms in movies. Given that movie's very tied to like the possessed mom character and whatnot. So you'll have to pick between Adam's two good choices for that particular episode, which will be Hereditary versus Serial Mom. Both will be very interesting. Whichever one of those we cover. Very interesting discussions. Very similar films, obviously.
I want you to know that I've been so avoidant on the trailer that you describing this is how I learned what's happening in Evil Dead Rise.
Oh, yes, yeah. The spoilers. I'm sorry if you're a trailer averse out there, everybody. But yeah, so Hereditary and Serial Mom, you'll get to vote for that. If you're a patron for just the $1, which that would include Kaycee, our wonderful guest. Thank you, Kaycee, for being not just a patron, but our guest here and a friend. Please go ahead and plug yourself. Where can people find you on the internet?
Well, you can find me at Twitter at _Kaycer, though I actually had to look to see what it was because I forgot. And I also realized, I have not tweeted since February 15th. So I think, say what you will about Elon, I actually feel like Twitter is running so poorly now that I'm actually spending less time on it because it's not giving me content I'm interested in. So thanks, Elon. You're improving my life a little. I guess you can find me on Instagram. I believe I'm just under Kaycee Jarrad, spelled the way my name is spelled. Why'd my parents have to name me that? Yeah, and if you want to support my work, you can either, go vote for a Democrat in your local primary, or if you need a car fixed in Queens, hit me up. I work at a mechanic shop now, even though I don't drive. It's very funny.
Good bit.
I had over my birthday, I explained it to my sister, and she was like, "This sounds made up. You are making this up." And I'm like, "Nope. I work for two guys, both named Ivan."
Look up Ivan's Body Works out there.
And no, it's about the brothers, because Ivan Sr., he has a brother named Pat, and if Pat goes home, then his brother Fred takes over. Fred kind of looks like Kyle MacLachlan in Twin Peaks Season 3.
Before your employers find out about this, we recommend you follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at DEDBpod. And you can also email us, doubleedgedoublebill@gmail.com, all spelled out, to submit feedback and stuff to us. And you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd at NotTheWho'sTommy. And I also do some writing at marianithomas.wordpress.com and at film-cred And, we've kind of been talking about the Oscars for this particular episode, obviously. I should mention that, traditionally, I've gone on friend of the show, Rafe Telsch's podcast, Have Not Seen This, every year to do sort of like an Oscar rundown of like some of the big categories. I've done that with him, Emily Slade, and Mel Gore, also friends of the show, in the past. And we had planned to do that for this particular Oscar season, but unfortunately Rafe had to cancel last minute due to some personal issues, so he couldn't record it for his particular show, and he had to bow out. I, with his blessing, decided to record the discussion at least with Emily and Mel, and we're going to release it on this feed as a bonus episode later in the week, like after this episode comes out, but before the Oscars at some point. And it'll be able for you to listen, and I had a lot of fun recording with those two. We missed Rafe, of course, very much, but there's still a lot of interesting discussion about a lot of the big categories and all that stuff, so it's a like solid regular episode length, even a bit longer bonus podcast. We'll be dropping in your feed later in the week. So for more of us, please subscribe or follow us on the various podcasting platforms like Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you're on Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows on the network here? And you can also dig into our archives and our Podbean main feed for like nearly 200 episodes before we joined TFS, and nothing else if you can't. Support us on the Patreon for that $1. We totally get it. Money can be tight for some people. The completely free way to help us out is just to rate, review, or simply share the show around. It gets us more visibility out there in the ether. But now, Kaycee, as we head to the end of the show, finally, as our Postman long-running time finally ends, we are going to be doing our picking for next week, as we do at the end of every episode. Basically, I have Adam's picks as well. During his sabbatical, he sent me his 2 picks, and I have my 2 picks. We switch up on quality between good and bad. I have the 2 good picks, Adam has the 2 bad ones, and we assign numbers between 1 and 10 for each of them. And, the other alt person picks number between 1 and 10 for those choices, and that gets us our good and our bad features. So Kaycee, for example, could say, for your good picks, I'm going to pick number 5, and I'll be like, okay, let's closest to number 3, which is this particular choice. And, that gets us the good and the bad pick. And next week's going to be interesting because it's episode 250 of the show. And usually around these, like, sort of, big milestone numbers, we like to do, some of our recurring kind of topics that are exclusive to the show. And this one is redemption. So given, what we do every week for the show, where we have 2 good and 2 bad picks, and we only pick 1 good and 1 bad one to cover on the next episode, another choice gets tossed into the dust, doesn't get picked. But once a year, we like to do redemption, where we take out 2 choices that were not picked previously and have them potentially be covered for the for an episode, just for these wayward Island of Misfit Toys kind of episodes. So Kaycee, for my 2 good picks for redemption, please pick a number between 1 and 10.
I am going to pick number 9.
All right. At number 8, this is a fun one because this is our alt from musicians turned actors, which was one of my picks. And this was a fun one because, it's very bizarre. And I think it's definitely one that I don't think we'd have much opportunity to cover unless it's for like a redemption or something like that. I have the Weird Al vehicle UHF.
Huh. I've heard about this movie for years. I keep thinking it's a wrestling thing and saying I'm not going to watch it. And then when I'm reminded it's a Weird Al thing, I go, oh, I should watch it. Huh.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Even when, one of the major supporting characters is played by Michael Richards, it's a lot of fun. Anyway, on the other side of things, over at number 2, I had my alt from Urban Fantasy, that episode, which was the Albert Brooks lovable sort of urban fantasy comedy, Defending Your Life.
I'm not even entirely sure, and I've heard of that movie. Huh. Albert Brooks is a massive blind spot. The only thing I've watched is half of broadcast news on an airplane trip to Italy, and I fell asleep because it was like 1 a.m. New York time at that point.
Basic logline for that movie: Albert Brooks plays a guy who ends up dying, goes up to a version of heaven, and the whole gimmick is the way you stay in heaven is you have to defend your life in front of like a little trial. So you have to look back at your life and defend all the choices you made, even the bad ones.
Fuck, I'm into that.
It's a pretty fun movie. Meryl Streep's in it. She's very fun. But Now, for Adam's 2 bad picks, please pick a number between 1 and 10.
Let's go number 2.
Okay. At number 4, Adam has a movie that, this will be interesting because it's the first time we've ever covered a remake for a movie we've previously covered on the show. Because this was his ult for cerebral sci-fi films for a bad choice. And he has the Total Recall remake, starring Colin Farrell.
A movie that exists.
It apparently does, and I'll finally get to watch it, because like most people, I didn't when it came out.
I remember thinking the original wasn't that long ago, and looking back, it was probably like 25 years, which is short, but not that short a gap between the original and a remake. I thought it would make a bigger splash, and it made less of a splash than the RoboCop remake. Another movie which does not exist.
Very true, very true. But on the other side of things, speaking of movies that don't necessarily exist, but at least are, I have a wager that this will at least be more fascinating than the Total Recall remake, because I've at least seen this one. It's weird. I have the alt for Natalie Portman that Adam had previously for the bad pick of Vox Lux.
That is an interesting movie. This is one of those times where it's like, oh, I should have. If I picked the other way, then I'm really curious how you guys would have covered Vox Lux.
Yeah, Vox Lux is I've seen Vox Lux. I've watched around the time of the Natalie Portman episode. That is a weird movie with a lot of different things we have to very delicately discuss. It is a fascinating movie.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there, as the kids say. This is not quite to the level of that time. If I picked it right, then you guys would have done a double feature of Halloween 3 twice, but this is up there.
That's true. That did.
I actually regularly wonder what you guys would have done in that case.
Who knows? Some alternate universe where we did that. You have to look into that portal. But that is the end of our episode. And until next time, everybody, you know what? We're at least half as long as the Postman. We can at least say that much.
That was my goal.